Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Dominic Waghorn, what would happen if Russia attacked Britain? Do you have any idea how the government that you pay for would react? How ready are we for that kind of threat? For the last few months, Sky's been wargaming what would happen if there was a Russian attack on the UK, just as they do in government. And it's been using real politicians with real experience, in a scenario created for them by a former advisor to the MOD, now leading Oxford University's War Centre.
He is putting us and NATO to the test, and we should work on the assumption that this will continue until and unless we respond.
So to confirm, Admiral, we are not expecting that the United Kingdom is able to defend realistically against our missiles. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So how did they perform, and crucially, how did the UK fare against an existential threat? Well, I'm joined by the creator and writer of this series, Sky's own security defence editor, Deborah Haynes, and former Conservative MP and Defence Secretary from 2019 to 2023, Sir Ben Wallace. Both of you, welcome. Deborah, first of all, tell us how you got the idea, how you put it together, and how long it took to make it happen.
Well, thank you so much for having us on the podcast. I've been a journalist for 25 years, and much of that time has been spent either covering war. So I was based in Iraq for a long time. I've been in Afghanistan. I've covered the conflict in Libya, and most recently, the war in Ukraine. So UK defence, and it's a difficult story to tell because the public, since the end of the Cold War, have experienced relative peace. You don't feel existential threat, which was something that was, it was part of everyday life during the Cold War. People had either lived through the Second World War or their parents had, and they therefore understood the structures that were in place during the Cold War, not just the need to have a lot of money spent on armed forces with capacity and a large reserve, but also civil resilience. So a civil population that was also aware of, the idea that potentially there could be a world war again, and maybe even involving nuclear weapons. So all of that currency, all of that language around defence, deterrence, it went at the end of the Cold War to a great extent, but in particular over the last decade or so, you've seen Russia as a threat emerging again and challenging, not just the UK, our NATO allies. There's a full-scale war in Ukraine. And at the same time, defence spending, the size of the armed forces and the state of national resilience has been allowed to fade. And so the kind of idea of the war game was to bring all of that to life. And just one final thing to say, the actual scenario, it is described as extremely low likelihood, but high impact. So that means there's a low chance of this happening, but catastrophic consequences if it did.
So you've got all these sort of ex-politicians, you've got Ben Wallace, you've got Jack Straw, you've got Amber Rudd playing various roles in a basement, a kind of a mocked-up bunker in central London, and you're throwing at them these scenarios. Straight off the bat, I should ask you, because I think people listening will say, it sounds quite alarmist, and we've got tensions rising between the UK and Russia. Do we need anything else that could intensify those tensions? What's your sort of defence of what you've done in that sense?
It's not alarmist. It's not scaremongering. It's not warmongering. It is setting out in a very credible, plausible way the reality of the threats that there are out there right now, the reality of the state of defence, the reality of the potential unpredictability of alliances, and playing out what all that might mean should they all come together. And rather than saying this is alarmist, we shouldn't be talking about this, surely much better to think about potential outcomes, potential threats, prepare for them, and then at least if it doesn't happen, carry on with your life as normal. If it does happen, you've got a plan. Right now, we don't have a plan.
And to your right here, you have your Prime Minister, Ben Wallace. Congratulations, you made it to the top job. People listening will want to know, of course, because you went through these scenarios in government, how realistic was it?
So I think what happens usually in government is we manage to face it on a case-by-case basis, but not if we went to the next step. That is where we're vulnerable. And this war game sets up lots of dilemmas, both the United Kingdom and hopefully for Russia as well and our allies. But the big change from my whole life is the question mark over the United States' current commitment to NATO. And that is not fiction. That is fundamentally a real possibility at the moment that the likes of J.D. Vance, the likes of Donald Trump could pull America out of NATO. And we have, in defense of the United States, taken NATO and its alliance and the 70% of NATO that is American contribution for granted. And suddenly it's taken a Donald Trump who doesn't ask very nicely these things, but is actually asking the same thing Obama asked in 2014, which is, come on, Europe, step up. And it's taken him and the threat of him leaving to make us wake up. So absolutely the scenario is low probability, but it would be a much, much higher probability, that scenario, if America refused to guarantee the security of Europe. And if you look at how Russia functions and Putin thinks, it becomes much higher than low probability if he thought America wasn't going to be there.
So what did you learn? So you're in this bunker. You've got, I mean, these are political former rivals as well. You've got Jack Straw, sort of a collection of very experienced people, and Deborah and her team of experts are throwing different scenarios at you, and it's getting more and more complicated and threatening. What did you learn about yourself and about the country through this exercise?
Well, I think just the first thing is the collection of ministers we had were all real. They'd all done the real jobs. And funnily enough, having done the real jobs in your government, they all basically understood the weakness of the UK and where we were at and wanted to contribute to, I think educating the public about what goes on. I had sort of two political mentors in my life, Ken Clarke and Jack Straw. It's not about party politics. And if one thing good comes out of this to the public, it is also a sense that governments of all colours, when a crisis or a threat to the country happens, they're all trying to do their best. And that happens all the time. I think what I learned from my experience, and I'd done about 50 Cobras in my time, which is probably because I'd been the security minister and everything else. We had those tragic terrorist attacks in 2017. We had Skripal, we had WannaCry. And then obviously we had a very busy time in defence. I think first of all, I learned that, you have to make judgment calls sometimes when there are no obvious answers. And leadership is often put at test where you have to just use your judgment. I served 5 prime ministers, so, I think that is probably a record. I've seen over the years prime ministers who want somebody else to give them a bit of paper saying, this is the answer. And they always wanted to commission another bit of paper. But sometimes there aren't any clear answers. You have to use your political judgment and your knowledge. You listen to your advisors. But there's no bit of intelligence that ever comes to you that tells you 110% about what someone will do if you do something. So I think what I learned is all the people in that room, I trusted the whole team. And Deb said afterwards, this wasn't like lots of acting because I'd all done it, right? Mark Sedwell, Lord Sedwell, the National Security Advisor, he was the Perm Sec in the Home Office when I was there. I knew him as well then in the programme as I did for real. And I always trusted his judgment. And
so it all felt very real.
Felt real. It felt with people we trusted. And so the challenge of any Prime Minister of a day is make sure you lead a team, not a presidency, and make sure you take an interest in your cabinet ministers. Because I would not like to have been there as a prime minister who was spending my whole life in a rivalry with my chancellor and my, that sounds familiar, and my defence secretaries and people who are on manoeuvres, because that's when government doesn't function.
But was there, personally, from your point of view, was there a sense of relief that you actually won't end up facing this challenge unless you go back into politics and become prime minister? Or was there a sense, God, I would relish this challenge?
It's often put at the door of defence ministries that, we're all warmongers. Funny enough, people like me who've served in the armed forces, I don't like war. I don't want to see people killed. I remember saying to Shoigu, the Russian minister, about 10 days before the invasion in Russia, in Moscow, I remember saying, I don't want to bury any more people, right? I've been to my own regimental funeral. And I said to him, and I don't want to see Russian people killed. I mean, he couldn't quite comprehend that I actually had an interest in avoiding war and death. Most of us are in the game of using military as a deterrence. And I think what Debs is trying to do here with her brilliant podcast is say to the public, look, freedom isn't free, right? If you want to stand up for your values around the world, you have to invest in your deterrence. You have to invest in sending a message to your adversaries that you're serious. It's a lot cheaper, by the way, than war.
Just on what Ben was just saying, I think a fundamental point as well that really does come out through the war game is that this isn't just about the armed forces. Is Chris Donnelly, who is a Russia expert, who is on the podcast too, and he makes the point that it's armed forces fight battles, countries fight war. And it's a really important reminder that during the Cold War, it was the whole of the nation that was resilient and many people ready to do their bit should the worst happen. Just in terms of the actual mechanics of the game, like I had nothing to do with the actual game itself in terms of on the day. It was created and run by a brilliant man called Rob Johnson, who he heads the Changing Character of War Centre at Oxford University, and he knows Ben really well and actually was seconded to the Ministry of Defence when Ben was the Secretary of State there and advised him internally about challenging the status quo. So he's the games master, it's called. He presents the information and the updates, and then it's up to Ben and his team, who don't know what's coming next, to respond. And we also have a Russia team. So we had in this basement, one room was for the British Cobra team. A second room, smaller room, was for the permanent joint headquarters, so the military headquarters. So Ben and his defence chief had a chief of joint operations running the warfighting side of things, not giving too much away. And then down a corridor was the Kremlin, and we had Russia experts sitting in the Kremlin. And sort of unusually for a war game, the Russia team, they knew the main moves that they had to make. They obviously came up with extra surprises.
They're trying to win, though, right?
They're trying to win, and they're also trying to explain why they're doing it. And that's the point. So I've been told that capability plus intent equals threat. Russia has the capability to reach our country. Who knows what the intent is? The Russian embassy actually came out last week after the government published its defence review, in which it described Russia as a threat. And in their sort of message on social media, the Russian embassy in London was saying that they have no intention to attack the UK. They wouldn't need to attack the UK. But Russia said on the eve of the full-scale war in Ukraine that they weren't going to launch a war, and look what happened.
Now, I guess you're not going to say who won. Maybe you are, but I guess people need to listen to the end of the podcast to find out whether the red team, the Kremlin won, or whether Britain was up to the challenge. But as the observer, not the ringmaster, as you say, but you were observing this, who did better, and what did this tell you about the people who would be in charge or have been in charge of this kind of challenge in the past, potentially?
So it's set in the near future. The first Cobra meetings is on the 5th of October of this year. And it starts in quite a familiar way. So there are news reports. We have these mocked-up news reports that try and create the reality.
It's 8 a.m. on Monday, 29th of September. Our top story this morning. Travel chaos on the railways.
So everyone's immersed in this new world, and everybody had to really play their part. And you've got like some power outages that have created travel chaos. Not really sure what caused the power outages. Could it be some kind of cyber hack? Could it just be bad services? And then you have this huge explosion that rips through a Russian naval base in the north of Russia. And the Kremlin immediately is accusing Britain of being behind the explosions.
A British frogman's outfit has been discovered on
the UK denies involvement, but Moscow isn't listening.
It is just the latest example of British-sponsored terrorism.
It recalls its ambassador to London. It describes the UK as sort of a hostile state.
And we should say, actually, that it's quite prescient. Last week, we had the Russian ambassador blaming Britain, basically, for being behind the drone attacks on Russia's airbase. We had Sergei Lavrov this week as well, saying that Britain's behind all the things going wrong in Russia. So it's very much on the money in terms of what Russia is saying at the moment about the UK.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. We draw on the reality of the current situation. And then Cobra is called by the Prime Minister because police suddenly find the bodies of 2 F-35 pilots that have been shot dead. There's sort of a suspicion, could it be sort of a Russia-linked double assassination? And then the crisis just gets worse from there. In terms of I'm not going to say who wins, who loses, but the purpose of the game is to test the UK's defences after decades of decline, to test the UK's alliances, which, as Ben has said, are increasingly unpredictable.
I mean, let's we can't say who won, but let's ask both of you: were you encouraged or discouraged by this exercise? Debs, first of all.
It's designed to make people think, and I think if people who listen, and I hope people do listen to the podcast, and just think about what's unfolding, it's really interesting in the debate at the moment about spending. There's so much debate about how much more you need to spend on health, on welfare, on economic growth, on schools, really important priorities that people can feel because they understand what it means to their own families not to be able to get to a hospital on time. But people no longer understand really why it's important for the army to have more than a few days' worth of ammunition. And so if this war game helps to just inform people about why defence matters and why having resilience matters, then that would be brilliant.
Ben, were you encouraged by this exercise, or did it leave you worried?
I not worried. I mean, I think the first thing is we have the skill base to deal with these type of scenarios. The confidence that you have with the people around the table, with our military personnel, our intelligence services, we have some of the best in the world. When it comes to hardware, we are severely challenged. And the one thing that is a fact, and you're just talking just there about Russia and it's blaming Britain, is what we do know about Russia is Russia absolutely wants a wedge in NATO. It wants to wedge the US away from NATO and effectively fragment that very successful international alliance that has kept Russia or the Soviet Union at bay for 70 years. And then what I would ask the listeners to ask themselves is, okay, what if they are successful? What if the United States pulls out of NATO in 2 years' time? That's a 70% funding military capability gone overnight. What does that mean for Europe and Britain and our security? There's been a lot of negative comments from the Kremlin about France recently as well. The United Kingdom and France, the two nuclear powers in Europe, are absolutely enemy number one for Russia, because we are the other two that potentially could defend Europe with our nuclear sort of umbrella. And so they will go after us too in sub-threshold, in information and division campaigns to weaken us. So that is a reality. That's why deterrence is driven by both a statement of determination of sticking together and indeed that we won't back down.
Are they going to be listening, though, in the Kremlin and learning from this? Is it useful human intelligence to see how British politicians deal with this threat? Is it something the Kremlin could actually benefit from, listening to your podcast?
A key rule in the game is that nothing that's discussed is classified. And that's the whole point. Russia already knows our weaknesses, but we ask the question, do you?
But they don't know how you might respond, you politicians.
I mean, I think what hopefully they will see is that the United Kingdom is considerate, logical, thinks about all these different issues, but also the other stuff they'll see that will be alarming is they already know. They already know that you see a Donald Trump who is currently looking flaky on NATO membership, that doesn't need our programme to show that. And they will already know the state of all our armed forces. So I don't think there's a giveaway. This is really about the public will be catching up with what the Russians already know.
Yeah, and on the contrary, you would hope that they would watch and be worried maybe that if the UK public did suddenly start to think more, revert back to the kind of Cold War thinking that we used to have as second nature, it just makes our country more resilient, better able to deter threats and better able to stand up to coercion and threats from Moscow.
That's it for today. The Sky News Daily is back tomorrow, and the first 2 episodes of the Wargame podcast are available now wherever you get your podcasts.